Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a calm little stroll, maybe more of a slow trudge, back to the Middle Ages. So dim the lights, pour some tea, and get cozy because I'm about to explain why you, yes you, with your 24/7 Wi-Fi, oat milk lattes, and memory foam mattress, wouldn't last a single day in medieval Europe.
His illness wasn't a one-time event. It came in episodes, stretching across decades. One year he'd be coherent, the next he'd be babbling to trees in Windsor Great Park, convinced he was conversing with angels. His son, the future George IV, spent much of this time scheming for a regency, only to be blocked whenever his father rallied back to sanity. Imagine waiting for your parent to fully lose it so you can finally take the job. Awkward family dinners, to say the least. By the early 1800s, George's episodes had become more severe and more prolonged. After the death of his favorite daughter, Princess Amelia, in 1010, he never really recovered. He went permanently mad, confined in Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and delusional, while his son ruled as Prince Regent. Official announcements spoke vaguely of His Majesty's indisposition, while everyone in Britain knew exactly what was happening. And once again, we see the pattern. The palace didn't tell the public their king was insane. They said he was indisposed. They issued carefully vague bulletins. They downplayed the raving monologues and the purple urine. Because the monarchy was an institution that couldn't admit weakness. George's story is sad, yes, but also revealing. He was a man who probably had a treatable condition, possibly porphyria, possibly bipolar disorder, but instead of care, he got leeches and shame. The royal household became a prison of secrecy, built not for George's health, but for the image of stability. And speaking of instability, let's glide back to France for a moment. Because if you thought one Charles the Mad was enough, history generously gave us another monarch who took eccentricity to new levels. Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, might have had delusions of grandeur, but his cousin, Empress Eugenie, had to deal with the legacy of French kings who couldn't quite hold it together. But before we float too far into the 19th century, maybe we should pause in the Renaissance with a king who believed he was made of glass. Yes, another one, because apparently glass delusion royalty was a mini-trend.
When he wasn't delusional, Charles could be lucid and perfectly reasonable, which made everything worse. Because every time he had a stretch of sanity, people got hopeful, only for him to spiral again. The court had to keep this semi-secret from the wider public, while rival factions tried to seize power during his breakdowns. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, often ended up running things in his place, which did not exactly win her fans. She became the scapegoat for pretty much everything, from political disasters to Charles' illness. The rumor mill accused her of sleeping with anyone who looked at her twice, and of course being German didn't help her case in French politics. Meanwhile, the actual problem, Charles's mental health, was never addressed. They didn't understand what was happening, and their options were basically prayer, bloodletting, or pretending he was fine. So the kingdom staggered along under a mad king. Factions fought, and France eventually slid into chaos. By the end of his reign, Charles was more symbol than monarch, a tragic figure wandering his palace in a haze, while everyone else tried to pretend the country was still functioning. And Charles the Mad was far from the only royal to unravel in this way. Let's float across the Channel, to England, where another king with a suspiciously similar name had his own famous breakdown. Henry VI of England, the poster child for bad luck in monarchy. Born in 1421, he technically became king when he was 9 months old, because nothing says stability like a baby king in the middle of the 100 Years' War. His father, Henry V, had been the golden boy of English history, charismatic, brilliant, conqueror of France. Henry VI inherited none of it. Instead, he was gentle, pious, and deeply uninterested in war. Basically, the exact opposite of what his nobles wanted. For a while, it looked like he might just get by as a mild, forgettable king. Then came 1453. Henry was 31 years old when, seemingly overnight, he collapsed into a catatonic state. And when I say catatonic, I mean completely unresponsive. For over a year, he didn't talk, didn't move on his own, didn't even acknowledge the birth of his son, which for a king is about as bad as it gets. Imagine the birth of your heir, and the father just stares blankly into space. Not a great look. While Henry was checked out, England was run by protectors and regents, which inevitably led to political chaos. Because if there's one thing medieval nobles loved, it was using a weak king as an excuse to fight each other. This particular mess spiraled into the Wars of the Roses, one of the bloodiest civil wars in English history. All while Henry sat quietly, sometimes recovering enough to seem normal, and sometimes slipping right back into silence. His episodes of mental collapse happened multiple times in his reign, and just like with Charles of France, the court tried to cover it up as much as possible. They hid him from the public, kept up appearances, and when he did appear in public, it was carefully staged. But everyone knew, because you can't exactly disguise the fact that your monarch is non-responsive in the middle of Parliament. Eventually, Henry's inability to function as king led directly to his downfall. He was deposed, briefly restored, and then deposed again. His enemies eventually captured him, and, let's put it gently, he did not die peacefully in bed. In the end, his mental illness wasn't just a personal tragedy. It changed the entire course of English history. But what's striking in both these cases is how similar the court responses were. Deny, disguise, and hope no one noticed. Because a king wasn't just a man, he was the state itself. If the king was mad, the kingdom was mad, and that was too terrifying for most people to face. So instead, they wrapped it in silence, gossip, and rumor. Of course, if we zoom out, royal madness wasn't just a medieval problem. It kept happening. Because let's be honest, centuries of inbreeding, pressure, and stress don't exactly make for stable dynasties. So next we'll drift gently forward in time to Spain, where the Habsburg dynasty produced some of the most famously unstable monarchs Europe has ever seen. Spoiler, it's not going to get prettier.
So we've floated through France and England, where madness came and went like unwanted house guests. Now let's dim the lanterns a little and step into Spain, where the ruling family, the Habsburgs, decided that marrying your cousin wasn't just acceptable, it was basically a lifestyle. And the end result was Charles II of Spain, nicknamed El Hechizado, which translates to the Bewitched. And honestly, that nickname tells you everything. Because no one took one look at Charles and thought, ah, yes, peak genetic health. Instead, they decided he must be cursed by witches, which was a more comforting explanation than the actual one. Centuries of inbreeding. Charles II was born in 1661, the long-awaited heir of King Philip IV and his niece. Yes, you heard that right. His mother was his father's niece, which made her both his cousin and his aunt. Family reunions must have been very confusing. The Habsburgs believed keeping bloodlines pure would strengthen their dynasty, but instead, it created a genetic lottery where almost every ticket was a losing one. The result? Charles came into the world sickly, deformed, and developmentally delayed. As a child, he could barely walk, struggled to speak, and often drooled uncontrollably. He didn't learn to walk until he was 4. He didn't talk until he was 8. By the time he became king, at the age of 3, yes, 3, everyone already knew things were not looking good. Now, if you're picturing a little boy growing into a tragic figure,
You're not wrong. But here's the thing. Charles lived to adulthood. He reigned for 35 years. 35 years of what was basically one long, extended royal crisis. His face carried the infamous Habsburg jaw, a chin so oversized and protruding that he could barely chew his food, which, paired with his digestive problems, meant he often swallowed meals whole. The court doctors tried everything, potions, charms, endless bloodletting, but nothing helped. And when he inevitably failed to produce an heir with either of his two wives, everyone decided the witches must have cursed his fertility too. Because, obviously, it couldn't possibly have been the centuries of cousin-on-cousin genetics. No, that would be too simple. Court life under Charles was a bizarre mix of denial and desperation. His mother, Mariana of Austria, basically ruled as regent for most of his life because Charles could hardly handle basic decision-making. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their courts in tones ranging from pity to horror, describing the king as an idiot or so feeble in body and mind that he cannot be expected to live long, which, again, turned out to be wrong. He lived until 1700, defying every gloomy prediction. But while Charles lived, Spain wasted away. Its economy collapsed, its empire shrank, and its government fell into paralysis. It's almost as if putting the entire fate of a global empire on the shoulders of a man who couldn't chew food properly wasn't a great idea. Who knew?
When Charles finally died at the age of 38, Spain was left without an heir. His death sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, one of those long, bloody conflicts that reshaped Europe. So once again, one man's personal tragedy spilled out into global chaos. And here's where the palace secrecy becomes fascinating, because Charles's condition was obvious. Everyone could see it. But inside the palace, officials still went to absurd lengths to pretend things were fine. Portraits of Charles were carefully adjusted by court painters to downplay his deformities. When foreign visitors asked about his health, ministers would insist he was strong and capable, which must have been hilarious for anyone who had just watched the king choke on a piece of bread. Let's float now from Spain to Bavaria, because Charles wasn't the only European monarch whose instability left his court in panic mode. If Charles was bewitched, then Ludwig II of Bavaria was, well, the fairy tale king, which sounds whimsical until you realize it was code for eccentric and probably not all there. Ludwig II of Bavaria was born in 1845, and from the start he was a dreamer. Not in the cute, poetic sense, more in the ignores politics while building giant fantasy castles in the middle of nowhere sense. He ascended the throne at age 18, tall, handsome, broody, the kind of man who looked like he should be starring in a Wagner opera, which, coincidentally, was exactly what he wanted. Because Ludwig was obsessed with the composer, Richard Wagner. Obsessed to the point of bankrolling his operas, inviting him to live at court, and writing him letters that, let's just say, had a tone somewhere between teenage fangirl and uncomfortably intense soulmate. Wagner, of course, milked this relationship for every coin he could get. Bavaria's government was less thrilled. Instead of ruling, Ludwig spent most of his reign building castles. Neuschwanstein, the famous one that looks like a Disney logo, was his creation, along with several other palaces, all in elaborate fantasy styles. They were beautiful, yes, but they also drained the treasury. Ministers begged him to focus on politics. Ludwig shrugged and ordered more turrets. As his reign went on, Ludwig withdrew further into his dream world. He avoided public appearances, held midnight dinners with imaginary guests, and had entire opera performances staged for an audience of one, himself. Servants grew alarmed, especially as his debts spiraled out of control. By 1886, the government had had enough.
They declared Ludwig insane, based on reports from doctors who had barely examined him and deposed him. He was placed under arrest in one of his own castles, which has to be one of the most poetic ways to lose your throne. A few days later, he was found dead in a lake under mysterious circumstances alongside his psychiatrist. Was it suicide? Murder? Accident? To this day, no one really knows. But what we do know is that Ludwig's court spent years trying to disguise his eccentricities. Ministers would issue carefully worded statements, downplaying his isolation. Servants were ordered not to discuss his strange habits outside the palace. And official portraits presented him as regal and serene, rather than the brooding recluse he actually was. And this is the recurring theme, isn't it? From Charles VI in France to Henry VI in England, to Charles II in Spain and Ludwig in Bavaria, the royal response to madness was never treatment. It was image management. Keep up appearances, issue polite lies, and hope no one notices that the kingdom is being steered by someone who believes he's made of glass or is too busy building fantasy castles to read a budget report. We'll drift next into the 18th century, where Britain's King George III would give Europe one of its most infamous cases of royal madness, complete with rumors of blue urine, long rambling speeches, and a court desperately trying to cover for him.
So, we've drifted past France, England, Spain, and Bavaria. Now we're heading to late 18th century Britain, a time of powdered wigs, polite manners, and one of the most infamous cases of royal madness in European history, King George III. Or, as Americans like to remember him, the tyrant in the Declaration of Independence. But tonight, we're not focusing on revolutions or tea parties. We're focusing on what was happening inside the royal palaces. And what was happening was strange. George III was born in 1738, and for most of his reign, he was actually respected. A family man, a stickler for duty, nicknamed Farmer George because he loved agriculture more than aristocratic glamour, which, frankly, is about as wholesome as monarchs get. He wasn't the type to throw wild masquerades or bankrupt the treasury on gold palaces. He preferred reading agricultural pamphlets. Picture your neighbor who keeps too many cows, but with a crown. Everything seemed fairly steady until it wasn't. In 1788, George suddenly spiraled into what doctors of the time called a derangement, and that's putting it mildly. He began talking endlessly, sometimes for hours without stopping. Servants noted he could go on for 58 minutes at a stretch without pause. His subjects didn't call him the king who rambled, but they probably should have. He lost the ability to filter his thoughts, so his speeches tumbled out in a chaotic river of words, often religious, sometimes nonsensical, and occasionally peppered with shrieking laughter. There were physical symptoms, too. His skin turned flushed and blistered. His eyes bulged. His urine, famously, was described as blue or purple, which sparked centuries of speculation. Was it a rare blood disorder? A psychiatric condition? A mix of both? Medical historians still debate it. The court's response was complicated, because remember, Britain at this point was balancing wars abroad, a fractious parliament at home, and the delicate issue of succession. Admitting the king was mentally unwell could tip the political balance, so they mostly tried to keep it quiet. Doctors were brought in, but treatments were exactly what you'd expect from the 18th century. Bleeding, purging, ice baths, restraining the king when he got too loud. None of which helped, of course. George's condition waxed and waned. Sometimes he was lucid, sometimes not. And whenever he recovered, courtiers would breathe a sigh of relief and pretend it had never happened. So, We've wandered through Charles the Mad, poor Henry VI, the bewitched Habsburg, Ludwig and his castles, and of course, George III and his Technicolor urine. Now let's slide gently backward in time to the Renaissance, that golden age of art, science, and monarchs quietly losing their marbles. Tonight's theme, glass. Yes, glass. Because, believe it or not, several royals in European history suffered from what historians now call the glass delusion, which is exactly what it sounds like. They were convinced their bodies were made of glass, fragile, and in constant danger of shattering. The most famous case is King Charles VI of France. Yes, him again, because apparently one mental breakdown just wasn't enough for Charles's resume. Remember, this is the same king who sometimes forgot his own name. Well, on top of that, he developed an elaborate fear that his body was made entirely of glass. Charles would wear specially reinforced clothing with iron rods sewn into it to protect him from breaking. He refused to let people touch him, and sometimes he would sit absolutely motionless for hours, terrified that any sudden movement might cause him to crack. If someone reassured him, he might respond with a kind of weary logic. Glass shatters. I am glass. Therefore, don't bump me. Which, as far as Renaissance logic goes, is admittedly pretty consistent. But Charles wasn't the only one. The glass delusion spread across Europe like a strange psychological fashion trend. Nobles, scholars, and yes, even more royals all developed similar anxieties. Doctors of the time wrote about patients who stuffed pillows into their clothing to avoid breaking, or who refused to sit down in fear that their glass buttocks might shatter on contact. There's even a story of a French nobleman who believed his head was made of glass. He lived in constant terror that it might crack, so he wore a specially padded helmet at all times. Imagine showing up at court, dressed like a knight, only to admit that no, you're not preparing for battle, you just don't trust your skull to stay intact. Historians debate why this delusion was so popular in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. Some say it reflected the fragility of political power. One wrong move and everything collapses. Others argue it was simply a fashionable metaphor that got stuck in people's minds. Either way, it gave us centuries of royals politely declining handshakes out of fear of shattering. Now, speaking of royals with strange mental twists, let's wander toward the Netherlands. Because if Charles thought he was glass, then Christian VII of Denmark thought, well, let's just say he had some unique hobbies. Christian VII was born in 1749, became king at 17, and almost immediately developed a reputation for being mentally unstable, which is courtly code for he was wildly inappropriate in public. Christian was intelligent, but prone to erratic behavior. He often lashed out, mocked his courtiers, and made crude jokes at formal occasions, which, admittedly, sounds like half of YouTube. But Christian's most infamous trait was his obsession with masturbation. And I do mean obsession. His doctors wrote about it. His ministers complained about it. His tutors begged him to stop. Christian himself bragged about it constantly in settings where polite society really did not want to hear about it. On top of that, he had fits of paranoia, mood swings, and what modern historians think might have been schizophrenia. His wife, Queen Caroline Matilda, who was, by the way, the sister of George III, quickly realized her husband was unfit to rule, which led to one of history's more scandalous side plots. Caroline had an affair with Christian's physician, Johann Struensee. Together, they effectively ran Denmark for a few years, until the scandal blew up, Struensee was executed, and Christian was quietly sidelined for the rest of his reign.
Once again, the court's response was secrecy, cover-ups, and desperate damage control. No one wanted to admit the king was unstable, so instead they treated him like a puppet, propped up for ceremonies, wheeled out when necessary, and quietly ignored the rest of the time.
What we're seeing again and again is that madness in monarchs wasn't unusual. It wasn't even rare. What was rare was admitting it openly. Most of the time, the palace response was the same playbook. Lock the doors, keep the servants quiet, and pretend everything was fine. And yet, the symptoms were often too obvious to hide. Kings thought they were glass. Kings babbled to trees. Kings built castles for imaginary friends. And still, their courts issued announcements like, "His Majesty is in excellent health," which makes you wonder how anyone believed it. But the real irony, these very same kings, the ones who were too fragile to function, were also the absolute embodiment of the state. Their personal breakdowns shaped entire wars, dynasties, and empires. The glass may have been in their heads, but the cracks spread everywhere. So, we've drifted through glass delusions and inappropriate kings. Next, we'll slide gently to Austria, where the Habsburgs, yes, them again, produced yet another monarch whose mind unraveled in spectacular fashion. Empress Elizabeth's tragic son, Crown Prince Rudolf, the man who turned his mental turmoil into one of the darkest scandals of the 19th century. If you've been floating along with me so far, you'll know we've visited glass kings, deranged monarchs, and a fair share of royal cover-ups. Tonight we rest for a moment in the melancholy world of Austria, a place of elaborate palaces, slow waltzes, and an empire where the royal family's private tragedies often became public mysteries. And no tragedy was more whispered about or more quietly concealed than the fate of Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria. Rudolf was born in 1858, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, better known to history as Sisi. If you've seen a romanticized film version of her life, you know she was famous for her beauty, her fashion, and her strange, often lonely life as empress. Rudolf inherited some of her sensitivity, her intellect, and sadly, her tendency toward private suffering. From a young age, Rudolf was expected to be perfect. He was the heir to one of Europe's great empires, groomed to embody Habsburg stability. But perfection is heavy to carry, especially when you have a mind that feels fragile under the weight of empire. Rudolf suffered from severe depression, physical illness, and a restless spirit that clashed with the rigid structure of the Habsburg court. He was fascinated by art, philosophy, and progressive politics, and impatient with the formalities of the Viennese palace. He wrote poetry, he debated politics, he fell in love with the idea of reforming the monarchy, and he carried, quietly, a deep despair.
By the mid-1880s, Rudolf was increasingly withdrawn. He took long walks alone, filled his journals with dark reflections, and began to speak about death with unusual calm. His behavior alarmed his parents, but as with other royal breakdowns we've met tonight, the palace didn't treat it as a medical crisis. Instead, they whispered about nervousness and melancholy while keeping him under close watch. Then came 1889, when Rudolf retreated with his mistress, Baroness Marie Vetsera, to the Mayerling hunting lodge, a small, isolated estate in Lower Austria. No one knows exactly what happened that night. What we do know is that the next morning, both Rudolf and Mary were dead. The official statement was carefully phrased, a tragic accident, nothing more. But whispers immediately began. Was it murder? Suicide? A romantic pact? The secrecy was so tight that historians still debate it today.
The Mayerling incident became the subject of novels, operas, and countless theories. For the royal family, it was a disaster they preferred to sweep under thick rugs of silence. Rudolf's mental state was never discussed openly. His suicide, if it was suicide, was turned into a hushed scandal, erased from official records. The crown passed away quietly with him, and Austria entered a new chapter of its history. But Mayerling stayed in the collective memory not just as a tragedy of the heart, but as a lesson in how royal courts handle mental collapse. The more fragile the monarch, the louder the hush. And this hush, this refusal to name and treat mental illness, is what we've seen again and again in history. From France to England, Spain to Bavaria, Britain to Austria, courts protected their image at the expense of truth. They dressed up madness in euphemisms, wrapped it in secrecy, and treated it like a scandal to hide. It's worth noting, in earlier centuries they didn't have the language we use today. Mental illness was rarely a medical diagnosis. It was melancholy, madness, hysteria, or sometimes just God's will. That language shaped the way these stories were written down or erased altogether, and it's why so many cases remain mysteries. But if we zoom out a little bit, we can see a pattern. Monarchies were fragile systems. They depended on the illusion of stability. A mad king wasn't just a personal problem, it was a threat to the legitimacy of the whole regime. So secrecy was not just a matter of privacy, it was politics. And that's why, even now, centuries later, these stories feel both distant and strangely relevant, because they're not just stories about individual kings. They're stories about power, vulnerability, and the lengths institutions will go to protect themselves. So if you've stayed with me this far, you've traveled through centuries of whispered scandals, padded gowns, midnight conversations with invisible guests, and kings who refused to touch anything out of fear they'd shatter. You've wandered through kingdoms where the mind of the monarch was the most guarded secret of all. And there's one last place we should visit before we rest tonight. A kingdom where madness was not hidden, but lived openly. A monarchy that turned instability into ritual, that strangely became part of its identity. But we'll drift there in the next part. Next stop, the Ottoman Empire and the world of confined sultans, where madness became a quiet, inevitable part of palace life.
So far tonight, we've floated through France, England, Spain, Bavaria, Britain, and Austria, courts that hid their monarchs' breakdowns behind a veil of secrecy. Now let's drift gently toward the Ottoman Empire, a place of elaborate palaces, endless intrigue, and a tradition where royal madness wasn't hidden so much as contained. The Ottoman sultans ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents for centuries, and the way they handled madness was unique. Because in the Ottoman court, madness wasn't treated like a scandal to be erased. It was treated like a matter of state security. By the 17th century, a strange custom had developed. When a sultan became incapacitated, whether from illness, age, or mental collapse, he was often quietly confined in the kafes, or cage. Not a literal bird cage, but a secluded part of the palace. Locked away, under constant watch, cut off from politics and public life. They were kings in name only, living in isolation. And this wasn't rare. Several Ottoman sultans spent decades in the kafes before even ascending the throne. Some were driven mad by it. Others already carried mental instability when they arrived. For them, confinement became a quiet prison of the mind. Take Sultan Mustafa I, for example. He ruled twice in the early 1600s, and both times he was removed for instability. Contemporary observers described him as melancholy and suspicious.
He would spend hours staring into space, speaking to himself, and refusing to leave his chambers. And when he wasn't king, he was locked away in the cafés, where he remained under guard. The reasons for these confinements were political as much as medical. The Ottoman court was a nest of intrigue. Rival princes, court eunuchs, and powerful women in the palace all watched each other closely. A sultan who could not rule effectively became a dangerous symbol. Confinement neutralized the risk without openly admitting a ruler was mad.
It was a subtle but efficient kind of secrecy. You didn't need to tell the public the sultan was unstable. You just quietly kept him locked up and let someone else run the empire. The illusion of stability was preserved. And for centuries, it worked. At least until modernity arrived and the custom collapsed. But confinement didn't always preserve sanity. Many sultans emerged from the cafés deeply unstable. Isolation was, unsurprisingly, a poor environment for mental health. They lived surrounded by guards and whispers, cut off from normal life, knowing their fate was entirely out of their control. It's a tragic, almost poetic picture. Kings in gilded cages, watched but unseen, their minds quietly unraveling. And yet, the Ottoman approach to royal madness reminds us of something we've seen before. Across centuries and continents, whether in France, England, Spain, Bavaria, Austria, or Istanbul, courts have always tried to control the problem quietly. Madness in monarchy is not just a medical condition, it's a political one. And secrecy, whether by cover-up, euphemism, or confinement, is part of the story. So far tonight, we've seen the same theme play out again and again. Madness happens. Courts cover it up. The public hears whispers. History remembers fragments. And monarchs, for all their power, end up as fragile as any of us, sometimes more fragile than most. As we near the end of tonight's slow journey, there's one final thread to follow. One last chapter to close before we rest. A quiet reflection on what these hidden stories of royal madness teach us about power, secrecy, and human vulnerability. In the next part, Part 7, we'll drift toward that reflection. We'll wrap tonight's story gently, looking across the centuries of hushed palaces and glass kings, and ask what it all means.
By now we've drifted through centuries of history. We've walked softly down palace corridors in France, England, Spain, Bavaria, Britain, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. We've seen kings who talked to trees, monarchs who feared shattering like glass, princes locked away for years, and emperors whose minds slowly folded under the weight of crowns. Tonight's story is not really about any single monarch. It's about a pattern, a long, quiet pattern that stretches across time. When royalty went mad, the world around them rarely admitted it. Instead, their courts hushed the truth. They disguised it. They turned madness into a kind of state secret, because admitting the truth was, in itself, a threat to the state. That hush took many forms. Sometimes it was denial. His Majesty is merely indisposed, said the courtiers of Britain. Sometimes it was euphemism, melancholy, nervousness, God's will. Sometimes it was concealment, locking a prince in a cage so no one would see him. Sometimes it was rewriting history entirely, as in the case of Charles VI, whose breakdowns were glossed over in official chronicles. It's worth pausing here, because in all these centuries, royal madness was more than a private tragedy. It was a political crisis. Monarchs weren't just individuals, they were symbols. They were living embodiments of the state. If the king faltered, the kingdom seemed to falter with him.
And for courts and governments, that was intolerable. So secrecy became a survival strategy. But that secrecy came with costs. It left generations of historians puzzling over gaps in the records. It buried stories that mattered. It turned mental illness into something whispered about rather than understood. And it left a legacy, a reminder of how power, image, and human fragility are tangled together. What we learn from these stories is subtle, almost sleepy in its weight. Power can isolate. Secrecy can protect, but it can also harm. And behind the gilded curtains of monarchy, madness has always been a quiet presence, not always visible, but always there. Perhaps that's why the story of royal madness feels both distant and strangely intimate. Distant because we live in a different age, with different monarchies, different politics. Intimate because it's a reminder that no matter how high the crown, the mind remains human, fragile, vulnerable, sometimes breaking, quietly, behind closed doors. So tonight, as we rest, we leave behind these corridors of palaces, these hushed stories of kings and queens, princes and sultans. We leave behind the whispers, the padded coats, the midnight walks, the padded cages, and we take with us a quiet thought that history is full of hidden lives, and sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones kept silent. Good night.